Hello, friends. Tonight we're starting with something that's going to make you grateful for absolutely everything in your modern life. We're talking about medieval times, and I don't mean the dinner theater with jousting knights and turkey legs. I'm talking about the real deal, the nitty-gritty, unwashed, flea-infested reality of life in the year 1325. But first, let me ask you something. Ever had a really bad day, like everything goes wrong, universe is against me kind of day? Well, buckle up, because we're about to meet some people who would trade places with your worst Tuesday in a heartbeat. So here's the setup. You've just been transported back 700 years. Congratulations. You've woken up in medieval Europe. Now, before you get excited about living in simpler times, let me paint you a picture that'll make you want to kiss your alarm clock. Meet your new self. Let's call you. Well, actually, nobody's going to call you anything because names were kind of a luxury back then, and you're definitely not luxury material. You're a peasant, which means you're about 90% of the population and 100% screwed by modern standards. Your bedroom, it's not a bedroom. It's a corner of a one-room hut that you share with your family, your livestock, and a thriving ecosystem of parasites who've been waiting all night for you to wake up. Think studio apartment. But if the studio was made of mud and the apartment came with complimentary farm animals, your bed is what happens when someone takes the concept of natural materials way too seriously. It's a straw mattress that's seen better centuries, stuffed with hay that used to live in a barn and honestly misses its old home. The smell is distinctive. Imagine wet dog mixed with old gym socks, with just a hint of something that makes you think, I really hope that's mud. Your pillow, what pillow? That's a modern concept like indoor plumbing and not dying of a splinter infection. Your blanket is a wool sheet that hasn't been washed since your grandfather was young, and it weighs roughly as much as a small horse from accumulated. Let's call it life experience. The church bell clangs in the distance. That's your alarm clock. And it's about as gentle as a construction site at 5 a.m. There's no snooze button. No gentle wake-up light, no soothing sounds of nature. Just clang, 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 until you remember that sleeping in is basically a sin, and the church takes sin very seriously. You try to stretch and immediately regret it, because your joints sound like a rusty door in a horror movie. You're 22 years old, which in medieval terms makes you practically middle-aged. Your back creaks like old floorboards. Your knees pop like bubble wrap. And your neck makes a sound that would send a modern chiropractor straight to therapy. The floor beneath your feet, well, it's either wet from last night's rain that leaked through your thatched roof, and yes, everything leaks in medieval times, or it's crusty from things we don't need to identify too closely. Either way, your bare feet are now officially part of the local ecosystem, hosting microorganisms that won't be discovered for another few centuries. Privacy never heard of it. Your entire family is waking up around you, along with whatever relatives decided to crash at your place indefinitely. There's no bedroom door, no curtains, no personal space, just communal everything, including the fleas, especially the fleas. The fleas have formed their own political party by now. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you're never truly alone because parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always with you. And this, my friends, is just how your day starts. It only gets worse from here. But here's what's fascinating about these people. They didn't know it was supposed to be better. This was normal. This was life. And somehow they found ways to laugh, love, and create beautiful things in between bouts of dysentery and religious terror. Now here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean horrifying by every modern standard of human dignity. Nature calls. And in the 14th century, nature doesn't just call, it screams, bangs on the door, and refuses to take no for an answer. So you've managed to crawl out of your medieval haystack of horrors. Congratulations. Now your body is informing you, in no uncertain terms, that certain biological processes wait for no peasant. Time for the bathroom. Except there is no bathroom. Modern toilet, not invented yet. Toilet paper. Don't make me laugh. Privacy. What's that dignity? Never heard of it. You're about to discover that answering nature's call in medieval times is less of a private moment and more of a community event that somehow involves the entire neighborhood. Your bathroom is a wooden bucket behind the house. It's already full because Uncle Wolfston had a rough night after eating questionable turnips that may or may not have been actual turnips. The smell emanating from this bucket is biblical. We're talking Old Testament levels of aromatic punishment. The kind of smell that makes you question your life choices and consider becoming a hermit. You hold your breath, do your business as quickly as humanly possible. And then here's the kicker. The part that would make a modern sanitation worker weep. You don't flush. You can't flush. Instead, you take this bucket, walk to your window, and toss the contents into the street. Yes, the street. The same street people walk on. The same street where children play and merchants sell food. You're supposed to shout "Gardaloo" before dumping. That's Old French for "watch out below." Though honestly, by the time you shout it, it's already too late for whoever's unfortunate enough to be walking by. It's like a medieval warning system designed by someone who clearly didn't think it through. Medieval streets aren't paved with good intentions. They're flowing rivers of human waste, animal droppings, rotting food scraps, and mystery liquids that would make a modern hazmat team quit their jobs and take up farming. It's like someone took a sewer system and decided it needed more public access and fewer safety regulations. Walking down a medieval street is like playing the world's worst game of hopscotch, except instead of chalk squares, you're trying to avoid puddles of things that should never be puddles. The smell is so powerful it has its own weather system. Rain doesn't clean these streets. It just makes everything more liquid and somehow worse. If you're lucky enough to live in a town with public latrines, congratulations. You get to experience the joy of communal defecation. Picture an outhouse, but instead of privacy, you sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in a long wooden bench with holes cut in it. Privacy is a cruel joke. Ventilation is just a word people will invent later. And conversation is, well, let's just say people talk about the weather a lot. What do you use to clean up afterward? Here's where medieval ingenuity really shines. Straw, leaves, twigs, moss, or if you're feeling particularly fancy, a scrap of wool, sometimes corn cobs if you can find them, sometimes nothing at all, which might explain why handshakes weren't popular yet and why people kept their distance during conversations. The wealthy castle dwellers had it slightly better. They had guard ropes, which were basically holes in the wall that dropped everything directly into the moat below. Great system in theory, except your enemies knew this too. Yes, attackers sometimes climbed up through the waste chute to infiltrate castles. Talk about taking the phrase "storm the castle" literally, and also talk about dedication to your craft. So whether you're a farmer facing the bucket and street system, or a noble with your fancy wall hole, medieval toileting is a humiliation ritual that's cold, public, dangerous, and never not disgusting. One slip on a wet stone path and you're face first in humanity's collective leftovers. And you still haven't brushed your teeth. But we'll get to that nightmare next, the truly amazing part. The people survived this. They lived full lives, fell in love, created art, built cathedrals, and somehow maintained enough optimism to keep having children who would inherit this exact same system. That's either incredible resilience or collective Stockholm syndrome. All right, you've survived the toilet experience. You deserve a reward, right? Maybe a nice breakfast, something warm, delicious, comforting to start your day. Wrong, Lauren. So very wrong. This is medieval Europe, where comfort goes to join and breakfast is less of a meal and more of an endurance test. Welcome to your daily encounter with pottage, the medieval world's answer to the question, what if we made food, but removed all joy from the experience? Pottage is a thick, gloopy stew made from whatever didn't run away fast enough when you approached with a cooking pot. We're talking grains, root vegetables, maybe some beans if you're living the high life and consider yourself part of the medieval elite. But here's the thing about pottage. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, possibly weeks. New ingredients are just dumped on top of the old ones, like some kind of archaeological dig you're supposed to eat. It's less of a recipe and more of an ongoing science experiment that somehow never ends. The bottom layer might predate your current political regime. The taste. Imagine if someone took cardboard, boiled it in sadness, and then seasoned it with disappointment. It's gray, lumpy, and has the consistency of something that should probably be used to patch holes in your roof rather than consumed by humans. On the side, you get bread. Now, when I say bread, I don't mean the fluffy, soft, wonderful bread you're thinking of. This is bread that could double as a weapon, made from coarse rye or barley flour, often bulked up with sawdust, ground acorns, and other creative ingredients because wheat is what rich people eat. And you are definitely not rich people. This loaf isn't your friend. You don't slice it, you negotiate with it. You don't bite it, you gnaw at it like a beaver working on a particularly stubborn tree. Some historians believe medieval bread was responsible for developing the jaw muscles that would eventually evolve into the ability to chew modern bubblegum. The bread is so hard that people often use old loaves as bowls for soup, which actually worked pretty well since the bread was essentially indestructible. You could probably build a house out of medieval bread, and it would last longer than most modern construction. What about drinks? You're not getting orange juice, coffee, or that fancy oat milk latte. You're drinking higher at 6 a.m. because the water is basically a soup of parasites, bacteria, and things that would make a modern microbiologist weep. So you start your day with weak ale, low alcohol content, high survivability factor. Kids drink it too. Nobody's happy about it. But it beats dying of dysentery before lunch. The beer tastes like someone took real beer, diluted it with pond water, and then filtered it through dirty socks. But it's safer than the alternative. Want some meat with your breakfast? Dream on. Meat is for Sundays, saints' feast days, and only if your Lord is feeling particularly generous, or if someone's cow died of natural causes and they need to use it quickly before it goes bad. Most peasants see meat maybe a handful of times a year, and when they do, it's usually something that was questionable when it was alive, and definitely questionable now. Fresh fruit only when it's in season, hasn't been eaten by worms, and hasn't already fermented into something that might technically count as alcohol. Vegetables are whatever you can grow in soil that's been fertilized with. Well, remember the street situation from earlier? Yeah. That spices, a pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly wages. Salt is so valuable, it's literally locked away in chests like treasure. Most of your flavoring comes from herbs you can grow yourself, assuming they survive the local wildlife, the weather, and your neighbor's goats. So you sit there, chewing your gritty bread that tastes like disappointment, gulping your medieval breakfast beer that tastes like regret, spooning down your pottage that tastes like giving up, and trying not to think about the rat that definitely sampled your breakfast while you were dealing with the bucket situation. But here's the amazing part. People found ways to make this work. They developed traditions around meals, shared stories while eating, created community around food. They made the best of what they had because what they had was literally all they had. And somehow they had enough energy left over to build those incredible cathedrals we still admire today. Though that might explain why medieval cathedral construction took centuries, everyone was operating on a diet of basically bread soup and optimism. Time to get dressed for your medieval day. And by dressed, I mean putting on the same clothes you've been wearing for months because, spoiler alert, you own exactly one outfit. Your entire wardrobe consists of a single ensemble. One, it's a rough wool tunic or linen shift that you've worn every single day for months, possibly years. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion. No outfit changes. No, let me see what else I have in my closet. It's just wear this until it literally disintegrates or gives you a fungal infection. The fabric is wool that feels like someone took steel wool and decided it wasn't scratchy enough. It was woven by someone who clearly had strong philosophical objections to the concept of comfort. The whole garment was stitched together by a person who apparently believed that clothing should be a constant reminder of life's suffering. Underwear, that's a luxury concept that won't catch on for a few more centuries. If you're incredibly lucky, maybe you have a linen under tunic? If not, you're going commando under layers of scratchy wool that will spend the entire day trying to remove your skin through friction. It's like wearing a medieval torture device disguised as clothing. Now, about washing these clothes. There's no washing machine, no soap that works worth a damn, no dry cleaner, no magical laundry fairies. Your clothes are stained with months or years of living, stiff from accumulated sweat and dirt. And they smell like a compost pile that's been marinating in a barn. Even if you wanted to wash them, it's a full production. You'd need to haul water from a well or river, heat it over a fire using precious firewood, scrub everything with ashes or lye that might dissolve your clothes along with the dirt, and then hang everything out to dry in the sun, which appears approximately 3 days a year in medieval Europe. Most people just, they wear the same clothes until they fall apart, then patch them, then wear the patches until they fall apart, then patch the patches. It's clothing archaeology. Shoes. If you're incredibly fortunate, you might own a pair made of untreated leather that's been stitched together by someone who learned cobbling from watching other people fail at it. These shoes offer about as much arch support as a banana peel and roughly the same level of water resistance. The soles are thin enough that you can feel every pebble, every stick, every unfortunate substance you step in. Most peasants just go barefoot year-round, trudging through mud, animal dung, medieval street puddles, sharp rocks, and disease cocktails that would make a modern epidemiologist have nightmares. Your feet develop calluses thick enough to qualify as natural shoes, and you become intimately familiar with every texture the medieval world has to offer. This fashion situation has consequences for your skin. Your skin absolutely hates you. You itch constantly, and I mean constantly. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs have set up permanent residence on your body and established their own thriving communities. Everyone has them. Nobles, monks, children, merchants. Everyone is basically a walking insect habitat. You'll be scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while having a conversation with a local priest. And nobody will even blink because everyone understands the struggle. Scratching is just part of social interaction. It's like medieval small talk. Your skin is raw from constant rubbing against rough wool. Your scalp is a battlefield of bites and scratches. And if you develop a rash, which you will, there's no dermatologist, no cream, no treatment. You just suffer through it for months while it becomes your constant companion. But here's what's truly wild. People still found ways to take pride in their appearance. They'd embroider their one tunic with whatever thread they could find. They'd weave flowers into their hair. They'd try to keep their clothes as clean as possible given the circumstances. Women would spend hours braiding their hair in intricate patterns, and men would trim their beards with whatever sharp objects they could find. They created beauty and self-expression within a system that seemed designed to prevent both. Because even when you only own one outfit and it's trying to kill you through aggressive itching, humans still find ways to express themselves, to take pride in their appearance, to show that they matter. It's one of those stubborn human traits that survives even the worst possible circumstances. And somehow, these itchy, scratchy, flea-bitten people manage to create some of the most beautiful art, architecture, and music in human history. Though I suspect a lot of medieval art was created by people who were desperate for distraction from their clothing situation. All right, you've eaten your sat at breakfast, put on your one outfit that's actively trying to torture you, and now it's time for work, except there's no office, no desk, no coffee break, no HR department, and absolutely zero chance of promotion. Ever. Your job description is beautifully simple. Don't die while laboring for someone else's comfort and profit. That's it. That's the entire medieval career ladder. You're a peasant, which means you work land that belongs to a lord who probably doesn't remember your name, wouldn't recognize you if he saw you. and definitely doesn't care about your opinion on crop rotation or work-life balance. You rise with the sun because you have no choice. And you stop working only when the sun disappears and you literally can't see what you're doing anymore. Your tools are a wooden hoe that's older than your grandfather, a rusty sickle that may or may not hold together for the entire day. And whatever bones are still intact in your increasingly creaky body, these are precision instruments in the same way that a rock is a precision instrument. They get the job done, but barely. There's no weekend. The concept of a 2-day break every 7 days is so foreign, it might as well be space travel. You work 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, and Sunday is supposedly a day of rest, but only if you're not harvesting, fighting off raiders, dealing with sick animals, or praying feverishly for your infected toe to stop turning black. The work itself is brutal in ways that would horrify modern labor unions. Fields need to be plowed by hand or with oxen if you're wealthy enough to afford one, which you're not. You dig ditches until your back screams, sow seeds until your fingers bleed, pull weeds until you question the meaning of existence, and carry water until your spine begins to resemble the letter S. No one cares if you're tired. No one's asking about your mental health or work satisfaction. There's no employee wellness program, no sick days, no vacation time. You work because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, you die. It's a remarkably simple and terrifying employment contract. If you're a woman, congratulations. You get all of the above plus a completely separate full-time job. You don't just do field work, you also care for children, clean the house, cook all the meals, spin wool into thread, weave cloth, feed the animals, tend the garden, preserve food for winter, and pretend that your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly migrating to your side of the bed. Women in medieval times were basically running a one-person corporation while also doing manual labor. They were medieval multitaskers, managing households that were essentially small businesses while also contributing to agricultural production. And they did it all while wearing that one scratchy wool dress we talked about earlier. Children start contributing to this joyful work environment around age 5. No school, no toys, no childhood development programs, just a tiny wooden rake and the crushing realization that this is what the rest of your life looks like. 5-year-olds are pulling weeds, feeding chickens, and learning the valuable life skill of not dying from preventable causes. If you're one of the lucky few who isn't a farmer, maybe you're a blacksmith, tanner, or cooper. Great, you still work with fire, dangerous chemicals, or animal guts all day in poorly ventilated sheds that would be condemned by any modern safety inspector. Your workspace is a death trap. Your materials are toxic, and your safety equipment consists of hoping really hard that nothing goes wrong. The pay for all this back-breaking labor survival. Maybe, if you're lucky and the harvest is good and your lord doesn't decide he needs more taxes, and the weather cooperates, and raiders don't steal everything, and disease doesn't wipe out half the village. It's like a medieval lottery where the prize is not dying. Break a bone. Too bad, keep working, get a fever, drink some warm beer and power through it, develop an infection. Pray harder and maybe try some herbs that probably won't help. You can't afford to stop working, not even for a day, because there's no safety net, no backup plan, no government assistance. Your job isn't a career, it's a slow-motion endurance test where the finish line is death. And yet, people found ways to take pride in their work, to develop skills, to create beautiful crafts and art during whatever spare time they could steal from survival. They built communities around shared labor, developed songs and stories to make the work bearable, and created traditions that helped them find meaning in what could have been soul-crushing drudgery, because humans are remarkably good at finding purpose and joy even in the most difficult circumstances. Let's talk about life expectancy in medieval times. And spoiler alert, it's not encouraging. If you make it past the age of 40, you're basically a celebrity. People might actually call you the old one, which is less of a nickname and more of a statistical miracle that deserves recognition. The average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 35 years. But here's the thing, That number is dragged way down by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before reaching age 5. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, or just one particularly bad winter. That's all it took. Medieval childhood was basically a series of survival challenges that would make reality TV producers weep with joy. If you managed to survive childhood, which was already beating the odds, you entered adulthood already exhausted by life. Work began as soon as you could walk upright and hold a tool, which meant by age 25, your joints were creaking like monastery doors in a windstorm. You might be missing several teeth, a finger or two from farming accidents, and most of your original optimism about existence. For women, there was an additional deadly gauntlet: childbirth. It was basically Russian roulette, but with worse odds and no choice about whether to play. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women, and there was no pain relief, no medical intervention, no emergency procedures, just prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you potentially bled out on a straw-stuffed mattress. Women faced this risk repeatedly throughout their lives because birth control consisted of prayer and wishful thinking. Having children was both necessary for family survival and potentially fatal for the mother. It was one of history's cruelest catch-22 situations. For men, the dangers were different but equally creative in their lethality. Farming accidents were common: a kick from a horse, a slip with a scythe, a fall from a roof while doing repairs. These weren't just injuries. They were potential death sentences because medical care consisted of hoping the local priest knew some useful prayers. Minor wounds could become infected and kill you through blood poisoning. A simple cut from a rusty tool could be your death warrant. Getting into a fight with your neighbor over property boundaries could result in getting your head bashed in with a farming implement. Even walking to the market was risky if you crossed paths with brigands, bandits, or just someone having a really bad day with anger management issues. Then there were the big killers that could wipe out entire communities. The plague turned cities into graveyards overnight. Whole neighborhoods would just disappear. Families would be there one week and gone the next, leaving empty houses that nobody wanted to enter because they understood, in a basic way, that whatever had killed everyone might still be lurking around. Famine could last entire seasons, sometimes years. Bad harvest meant not just hunger, but starvation. And starving people make desperate choices that often lead to disease, violence, or death from eating things that technically aren't food. Desperate people would eat grass, tree bark, leather, anything to fill their stomachs, which often just made them sicker. Sometimes death came from pure bad luck. Eating spoiled grain could cause ergot poisoning, leading to hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Drinking contaminated water could give you dysentery. Getting caught in bad weather without proper shelter could kill you from exposure. Medieval life was basically a daily game of, will this kill me? And the answer was often, quite possibly, yes. When people did die, which was often, funerals were quick affairs. Bodies needed to be buried fast to prevent disease from spreading. There was no embalming, no elaborate funeral homes, no polished coffins, just a hole in the ground, some hastily muttered prayers, and a shallow mound of dirt to mark the spot, assuming there was still space left in the churchyard. Most people died within a few miles of where they were born, having never traveled more than a day's walk from their village. Their world was small, their lives were hard, and their deaths were usually early. And yet, and this is the truly remarkable part, people still found reasons to laugh, to love, to create beautiful things. They built magnificent cathedrals that took centuries to complete. They wrote poetry, composed music, told stories that we still remember today. They fell in love, had children, made friends, and found joy in small moments. They didn't know their lives were supposed to be better because this was all they knew. They made the best of what they had because making the best of things is what humans do. They created meaning, purpose, and beauty in a world that was often brutal, unfair, and short. So tonight, when you go to bed in your clean sheets, in your private room, with your indoor plumbing and central heating and modern medicine, just a phone call away, Maybe take a moment to appreciate the absolutely miraculous circumstances of your existence, because you're living better than kings and queens did just a few centuries ago, and infinitely better than the average person who came before you. You've won the lottery of human history just by being born when and where you were. Sweet dreams. And remember, tomorrow you get to wake up in the 21st and where the worst thing about your morning might be running out of coffee. Our medieval ancestors would consider that the height of luxury, and honestly, they wouldn't be wrong. Now let's fast forward a few centuries and meet someone who looked at the hand life dealt her and said, actually, I think I'll reshuffle this deck entirely. Thank you very much. Her name was Sophie, and she was about to pull off one of history's most spectacular career changes. Meet Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg. And yes, that's her actual name. Try saying that 3 times fast while cursing in German. She was born in 1729 in a tiny German duchy that most people couldn't find on a map, even if you gave them a magnifying glass and a really good atlas. Sophie's family had all the noble blood you could want and about as much actual power as a decorative houseplant. Her father was a minor German prince who also happened to be a Prussian military officer, the kind of guy who was more interested in military formations than family formations. He was absent more often than he was present, which in retrospect might have been a blessing given what we know about Prussian parenting techniques. Her mother, Johanna, was a different story entirely. Cold, calculating, and obsessed with climbing the social ladder. She looked at little Sophie the way a chess master looks at a particularly promising pawn. Johanna wasn't interested in nurturing her daughter's emotional development. She was interested in engineering her daughter's strategic advancement up the European royal hierarchy. From Sophie's perspective, life looked pretty limited. She was living in a castle that was basically a fancy farmhouse, in a duchy so small you could probably walk across it during lunch break, with parents who saw her as either a political opportunity or a mild inconvenience, depending on the day. But here's the thing about Sophie. She had something that her family's tiny castle couldn't contain, a mind like a steel trap and an appetite for power that would eventually reshape an empire. While other noble girls were learning embroidery and how to faint gracefully, Sophie was reading everything she could get her hands on. Philosophy, history, literature. She devoured it all like someone who suspected she might need this information later. She learned multiple languages not because it was fashionable, but because she understood that knowledge was power, and power was what she wanted. She developed what we might call today emotional intelligence, the ability to read a room, understand what people wanted, and figure out how to give it to them in ways that would benefit her. Unlike most girls of her time and social class, Sophie didn't dream about finding a handsome prince and living happily ever after. She was more interested in becoming the prince herself, metaphorically speaking. She had ambitions that extended far beyond the borders of her tiny homeland. When she was just 14, opportunity came knocking in the form of Empress Elizabeth of Russia. Elizabeth was shopping for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, and Sophie fit the basic requirements. She had noble blood. She was Protestant, which she'd be expected to convert from, and she had a reputation for intelligence and grace. Now here's where most teenage girls might have been thrilled about the prospect of marrying into one of Europe's most powerful royal families. But Sophie was thinking bigger. She wasn't just interested in marriage. She was interested in empire. She looked at this opportunity and saw not just a wedding, but a hostile takeover waiting to happen. Here's what makes Sophie's story so remarkable. At age 14, she made a decision that would define not just her life, but the course of Russian history. She said yes to the proposal, but she wasn't saying yes to becoming Peter's wife. She was saying yes to becoming Russia's ruler. She just didn't mention that part to anyone. So in 1744, this teenage German princess packed up her few belongings, said goodbye to her tiny duchy, and traveled to Russia wearing thin German fabrics and a diplomatic smile that hid ambitions the size of continents. Her mother pushed her forward like a chess piece, but Sophie was already thinking several moves ahead in a game that everyone else didn't even realize was being played. When Sophie stepped off that carriage in St. Petersburg, she was stepping into a world that would try to break her, reshape her, and use her for purposes she had no interest in serving. What nobody watching that quiet, polite teenage girl could have predicted was that she was about to turn the tables on everyone. She wasn't going to be shaped by Russia. She was going to reshape Russia. But first, she had to survive a court that made medieval life look like a luxury resort, navigate a marriage that would make most people consider celibacy, and figure out how to seize power in a country where women weren't supposed to have any. No pressure, right? So here's young Sophie, fresh off the boat from Germany, standing in the Russian imperial court and realizing that everything she thought she knew about political intrigue was basically kindergarten level compared to what she was walking into. The Russian court wasn't just complicated, it was a 24/7 masterclass in paranoia, backstabbing, and survival of the most cunning. But Sophie had a plan. Actually, she had several plans. Because if there's one thing you learn when you're a minor German princess with major ambitions, it's that backup plans need backup plans. Step one in Sophie's transformation: become more Russian than the Russians. And I mean this literally. She threw herself into learning Russian like someone whose life depended on it, which, let's be honest, it probably did. She didn't just learn the language. She mastered it until she spoke it better than many Russian nobles who couldn't be bothered to speak properly because they preferred French anyway. But language was just the beginning. Sophie studied Russian history until she could recite genealogies that most Russians had forgotten. She memorized Orthodox rituals until she could perform them flawlessly. She learned Russian customs, Russian politics, Russian literature. Basically, she downloaded the entire Russian cultural operating system and installed it in her brain. Then came the big transformation: religious conversion. To become acceptable in Russian society, Sophie had to convert from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy. This wasn't just changing churches, this was changing identity. The conversion ceremony was public, symbolic, and absolutely life-altering. She wasn't just changing religions, she was burning every bridge back to her old life. During the ceremony, she took the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. It was more than a name change. It was a complete identity reconstruction. Sophie, the German princess, was officially dead. Catherine, the Russian Grand Duchess, was born. And Catherine had ambitions that Sophie could never have achieved. Here's what's brilliant about Catherine's strategy. She understood that power in Russia didn't just come from marriage or birth. It came from legitimacy. And legitimacy came from being more authentically Russian than anyone could question. She wasn't trying to import German ideas into Russia. She was becoming Russian in ways that made her irreplaceable. While other foreign princesses might have maintained their original cultures and remained outsiders, Catherine dove so deep into Russian identity that she became indispensable. She knew Russian law better than the lawyers, Russian history better than the historians, and Russian orthodoxy better than some of the priests. But here's where Catherine's genius really showed. She didn't just learn Russian culture, she fell in love with it. This wasn't just strategic performance, it was genuine transformation. She embraced the complexity, the contradictions, the grand dramatic sweep of Russian identity. She understood that Russia wasn't just a country, it was an idea, a feeling, a way of being in the world that was both brutal and beautiful. The Russian court watched this transformation with fascination and suspicion. Here was this teenage German girl who was becoming more Russian than people who'd been Russian for generations. Some admired her dedication, others suspected it was all an elaborate performance. They were both right. Catherine was performing, but she was also becoming. She was strategic, but she was also sincere. She was calculating her moves, but she was also genuinely falling in love with the country she planned to rule. And all of this transformation was happening while she was dealing with the elephant in the room: her upcoming marriage to Grand Duke Peter, who was turning out to be less grand and more disappointment with a crown. Peter was everything Catherine wasn't: petulant where she was diplomatic, childish where she was mature, openly contemptuous of Russia where she was passionately committed to it. While Catherine was learning Russian, Peter was playing with toy soldiers. While Catherine was studying Orthodox theology, Peter was making fun of Russian customs. While Catherine was building alliances, Peter was alienating everyone who mattered. The contrast was becoming obvious to everyone at court, and that created both opportunity and danger for Catherine. On one hand, her competence made her look good by comparison. On the other hand, competent women in positions of potential power made people nervous, especially when their husbands were incompetent men in positions of actual power. Catherine had to walk an incredibly fine line, be impressive enough to gain respect and influence, but not so impressive that she threatened the established order before she was ready to overthrow it entirely. She had to be the perfect Russian Grand Duchess while secretly planning to become the perfect Russian Empress. And she had to do all of this while maintaining the fiction that she was just a dutiful wife-to-be who had no political ambitions beyond supporting her husband. It was like being a secret agent whose cover story was being a demure princess. Except the stakes were an empire, and the penalty for getting caught was probably death. But Catherine had patience. She understood that transformation takes time, and that the best revolutions are the ones that nobody sees coming until they're already over. She was building something that looked like adaptation but was actually preparation. The German princess was gone. The Russian Grand Duchess was here, and the future Empress was waiting for her moment. Let's talk about Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter, which was basically a masterclass in how to turn a political alliance into a personal nightmare, while somehow using that nightmare to fuel world-changing ambitions. It's like a really depressing fairy tale where nobody lives happily ever after. But one person ends up ruling an empire. So there's that. Catherine's wedding to Peter in 1745 was supposed to be the culmination of all that careful diplomacy and strategic planning. Two young nobles, uniting their bloodlines, securing alliances, continuing dynasties, all the usual royal marriage stuff. What it actually became was more like a sitcom about two completely incompatible people trapped in the world's most expensive arranged marriage. Peter wasn't exactly Prince Charming material. Imagine if someone took all the worst qualities of an immature teenager and gave them unlimited power and a crown. He was awkward, emotionally stunted, and completely obsessed with military toys in a way that would have been endearing in an 8-year-old, but was deeply concerning in a future emperor. Here's how bad it was. Some historical accounts suggest that Peter refused to consummate the marriage for years. Years. They were married, living in the same palace, expected to produce heirs for the Russian throne. And Peter was more interested in his collection of toy soldiers than in his actual wife. Catherine basically had the world's most politically significant sexless marriage. While Catherine was throwing herself into Russian culture with the passion of a true convert, Peter was doing the opposite. He openly idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's enemy, and made no secret of his contempt for Russian customs, Russian people, and basically everything Russian except the crown he was supposed to inherit. Picture the dinner conversations. Catherine, fluent in Russian, discussing Orthodox theology and Russian poetry. Peter, playing with toy armies and complaining about how much better things were in Prussia. It's like being married to someone who constantly tells you how much they hate your country, your religion, and your interests, except you can't get divorced because it would cause an international incident. But here's where Catherine's strategic brilliance really started to show. She used Peter's deficiencies to her advantage. Every time Peter insulted Russian traditions, Catherine defended them more eloquently. Every time Peter showed his ignorance of Russian culture, Catherine demonstrated her deep knowledge. Every time Peter acted like a petulant child, Catherine displayed the maturity and wisdom of a future leader. The contrast wasn't subtle. Russian nobles started looking at this German princess who was more Russian than their German prince. And they started having thoughts that were probably treasonous, but definitely logical. Meanwhile, Catherine was dealing with the broader political situation, which was about as stable as a house of cards in an earthquake. Empress Elizabeth was still ruling, but her health was declining, and everyone knew a transition was coming. The court was full of people positioning themselves for the future, making alliances, and basically preparing for whatever political upheaval might follow Elizabeth's death. Catherine couldn't trust her husband, who was too immature and unpredictable to be a reliable ally. She couldn't trust her mother-in-law, who saw her as useful but expendable. She couldn't trust most of the court, where today's friend could be tomorrow's enemy, depending on which way the political winds were blowing. So Catherine did what brilliant people do in impossible situations. She built her own network. She cultivated relationships with military officers who respected competence over bloodline. She befriended intellectuals who valued her genuine interest in ideas. She charmed foreign diplomats who appreciated her political sophistication. She also started having affairs. Because if your husband is ignoring you for toy soldiers, and you're stuck in a loveless political marriage, and you're a young woman with normal human needs, you make the best of a bad situation. But even Catherine's affairs were strategic. She chose lovers who were politically useful, personally discreet, and genuinely devoted to her interests. The most significant of these relationships was with Gregory Orlov, a military officer who was everything Peter wasn't: mature, competent, passionate about Russia, and completely devoted to Catherine. The Orlov brothers were well connected in military circles, and their support would prove crucial when Catherine finally made her move. But that was still years away. For now, Catherine had to endure being married to a man who was essentially a political liability with a crown. While building the foundations for what would become one of history's most successful coups, she was learning patience on a level that would have impressed Buddhist monks. She was playing a game where the stakes were an empire. The timeline was measured in decades, and one wrong move could mean exile, imprisonment, or death. And through it all, she maintained the public facade of being a dutiful wife to a future emperor, while privately building the alliances and expertise that would eventually allow her to become the emperor herself. It was like being in a really bad marriage while secretly planning to take over the family business. Except the family business was Russia, and taking it over would require overthrowing your husband and possibly having him killed. Just another day in 18th century royal politics. All right, here's where things get really interesting. It's 1762, and Catherine has been playing the long game for nearly 2 decades. She's been the dutiful Grand Duchess, the patient wife, the strategic ally builder. But now Empress Elizabeth is dead. Peter is finally emperor. And Catherine is about to discover that sometimes the universe hands you exactly the opportunity you've been preparing for your entire adult life. Peter III's reign was like watching someone take a perfectly good empire and systematically destroy it through a combination of incompetence, arrogance, and spectacularly bad judgment. We're talking about 6 months of decisions so catastrophically stupid that they almost seem deliberately designed to make Catherine look good by comparison. Let's catalog Peter's greatest hits of political suicide. First, he immediately made peace with Prussia, basically throwing away all of Russia's gains from the 7 Years' War because he had a fanboy crush on Frederick the Great. Russian soldiers had died for those victories, and Peter just gave them back for free because he thought Frederick was cool. Then he started attacking the Orthodox Church, which in 18th century Russia was like declaring war on gravity. Technically possible, but you're going to lose that fight, and it's going to hurt. He mocked religious traditions, threatened to secularize church lands, and generally behaved like someone who had never heard of the concept of reading the room. But wait, there's more. Peter also managed to alienate the military by forcing them to adopt Prussian uniforms and drill techniques, because apparently looking like the enemy you just finished fighting was a great way to boost morale. He humiliated long-serving Russian officers and promoted his German cronies, because nothing says strong leadership like showing contempt for your own military. And the cherry on top of this disaster Sunday, Peter started making very public plans to divorce Catherine so he could marry his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova. This wasn't just personal, it was political dynamite. Catherine was popular, well-connected, and had spent years building relationships throughout Russian society. Peter was essentially planning to discard his greatest political asset for a woman who brought nothing to the table except his personal infatuation. Catherine watched all of this unfold with the calculating gaze of someone who had been waiting 17 years for exactly this moment. Peter wasn't just making mistakes, he was systematically destroying every source of support he might have had. The church hated him, the military distrusted him, The nobility thought he was dangerous, and the common people saw him as a foreign puppet who despised everything they held sacred. Meanwhile, Catherine had spent those same 17 years becoming everything Peter wasn't. She was Orthodox where he was dismissive of religion. She was Russian where he was German. She was competent where he was chaotic. She respected Russian traditions where he mocked them. She understood Russian politics where he was oblivious to them. When Catherine finally decided to move, it wasn't really a coup. It was more like accepting an offer that the entire Russian establishment was desperately hoping she would accept. The military officers who had watched Peter humiliate their institution were ready to support someone who understood the value of Russian military traditions. The church officials who had seen Peter mock their faith were eager to back someone who had genuinely converted and shown respect for orthodoxy. The actual coup was almost anticlimactic in its smoothness. On July 9, 1762, while Peter was away at his summer palace, probably playing with toy soldiers, Catherine simply rode into St. Petersburg, met with her supporters, and allowed herself to be proclaimed Empress Catherine II. The military units in the capital immediately declared their loyalty to her. The Orthodox Church blessed her accession. The Senate confirmed her authority. Foreign diplomats started drafting congratulatory messages. It was like the entire Russian government had been waiting for someone to give them permission to recognize what everyone already knew: Catherine was the real leader. And Peter was just the guy who happened to have been born with a claim to the throne. Peter, when he finally learned what had happened, tried to negotiate. He offered to share power, to step down peacefully, to leave the country, anything to avoid complete disaster. But Catherine understood something that Peter never had: power. Once seized, must be held absolutely. There's no such thing as a partial coup or a friendly abdication when the stakes are this high. Peter was arrested, forced to abdicate, and died a few days later under circumstances that were officially described as hemorrhoidal colic, but were almost certainly murder. Catherine probably didn't order his death directly, but she definitely didn't prevent it. And she understood that a living ex-emperor was a permanent threat to her legitimacy. In the span of about a week, Catherine had gone from being a potentially disposable foreign wife to being the absolute ruler of the largest empire on earth. She had pulled off what was essentially a hostile takeover of Russia, and she had done it so smoothly that most people barely noticed it was happening until it was already over. But here's the thing about successful coups: the easy part is taking power. The hard part is keeping it. Catherine now had to prove that she deserved the throne she had seized. And she had to do it while managing an empire that was vast, complex, and full of people who might decide that overthrowing an empress was just as feasible as overthrowing an emperor. The German princess who had arrived in Russia as a teenage pawn was now Catherine II, Empress of all Russia. But the real test wasn't behind her. It was just beginning. So now Catherine has the throne. But here's the thing about power gained through a coup: everyone knows you're willing to overthrow legitimate rulers, which means everyone's wondering if someone might do the same thing to you. Catherine understood this perfectly, which is why her early reign was basically a masterclass in how to transform yourself from a successful rebel into an indispensable leader. Catherine's first challenge was legitimacy. Yes, she was empress, but she was a German-born woman who had taken power by force from her husband. In 18th century Europe, that checked basically every box for probably shouldn't be running an empire. She needed to prove that she wasn't just a lucky opportunist, but someone who actually deserved to rule the largest country on earth. Her solution was brilliant. She decided to out-Russian the Russians while simultaneously becoming the most enlightened ruler in Europe. It was like being a method actor who decides to become the character permanently. Except the character was perfect autocratic monarch, and the stage was an empire spanning 11 time zones. Catherine threw herself into governance with the same intensity she had brought to learning Russian culture. She read everything: law codes, economic treatises, philosophical works, military manuals. She corresponded with Voltaire, Diderot, and other Enlightenment thinkers, not just because it was fashionable, but because she genuinely wanted to understand how to create a more rational, effective government. But Catherine was too smart to try to revolutionize Russia overnight. She understood that successful reform requires patience, strategy, and the ability to balance idealistic goals with political reality. So she moved carefully, testing what was possible while building support for larger changes. One of her most ambitious early projects was legal reform. Russian law was basically a collection of contradictory traditions, imperial decrees, and local customs that had accumulated over centuries. Catherine wanted to create a comprehensive legal code based on Enlightenment principles: equality before the law, proportional punishment, protection from arbitrary arrest. She established the Legislative Commission in 1767, bringing together representatives from across Russian society to help create this new legal system. Her nakaz, the instruction, was essentially her manifesto for how a rational government should work. It talked about human dignity, the importance of education, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve their people's welfare. For an 18th century autocrat, this was radical stuff. Catherine was essentially arguing that legitimate government required the consent and welfare of the governed, even while maintaining that she had absolute authority to implement these principles. But Catherine also understood Russian realities. While she talked about equality and human dignity in her legal theories, she knew that actually freeing the serfs would probably trigger a civil war that would destroy everything she was trying to build. So she moved carefully, improving conditions where she could, while avoiding changes that would threaten the fundamental power structure that kept her in control. This balancing act defined Catherine's entire reign. She was a philosopher queen who had to govern through practical politics. She wanted to modernize Russia, but she couldn't move faster than Russian society was willing to follow. She believed in Enlightenment ideals, but she ruled through autocratic power. Catherine also understood that foreign policy was domestic policy by other means. A successful empress needed military victories to prove her competence and secure her throne. So she launched wars against the Ottoman Empire, not just for territorial gain by Rome, but to demonstrate that a German-born woman could defend Russian interests better than the Russian-born man she had replaced. These wars were spectacularly successful. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Grigory Potemkin, Russian forces captured Crimea, gained access to the Black Sea, and extended Russian influence into areas that had been Ottoman for centuries. Every victory made Catherine more popular at home and more respected abroad. But Catherine's greatest achievement might have been cultural. She transformed St. Petersburg into one of Europe's most sophisticated capitals. She collected art, built palaces, founded schools, and patronized writers and artists. She wanted Russia to be seen not just as a military power, but as a center of culture and learning. She also understood the importance of managing her image. Catherine carefully crafted her public persona as an enlightened ruler who combined feminine wisdom with masculine strength. She posed for portraits in military uniform, wrote political treatises, and generally presented herself as someone who transcended traditional gender roles through sheer competence. The woman who had arrived in Russia as a teenage pawn was now one of Europe's most powerful and respected rulers. She had proven that power could be seized through intelligence and determination, and that legitimacy could be earned through effective governance. But Catherine's reign was far from over, and some of her greatest challenges were still ahead. Managing an empire is hard enough when everyone agrees you should be in charge. It's even harder when you're constantly proving that you deserve power while simultaneously wielding it to reshape an entire civilization. Catherine had won the throne through coup and cunning. Now she had to prove she could keep it through wisdom and strength. And for the next 30 years, that's exactly what she did. The German princess was gone, the Russian empress was here to stay, and she was just getting started. Let's travel now to 1994 to the humid depths of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico, where archaeologists were about to stumble upon one of the most haunting mysteries in Maya history. Picture this steaming jungle, ancient pyramids poking through the canopy like stone fingers reaching toward the sky, and a team of researchers who thought they were just doing routine survey work. Dr. Fanny Lopez Jimenez and her team were working at Palenque, one of the most spectacular Maya sites ever discovered. If you've never been there, imagine an ancient city carved from limestone and dreams. where every building seems to whisper secrets in a language that died out centuries ago. It's the kind of place that makes you believe in magic, or at least in the extraordinary capabilities of human civilization. The team was surveying Temple 13, which sounds impressive until you realize it's basically the little sibling of the famous Temple of the Inscriptions. Temple of the Inscriptions is where they found Pakal the Great, think Maya pharaoh, but with better architecture and more complicated mathematics. Temple 13 was just sitting there next door, modest and overlooked, like the quiet kid in class who turns out to be a genius. They weren't expecting much. Pakal's tomb had already been discovered decades earlier, and most archaeologists figured that one spectacular royal burial per site was probably the limit. But then they noticed something odd about Temple 13's structure, something that made them think, that's not quite right. There were signs of a sealed chamber beneath the temple, not looted, not disturbed, not touched by centuries of treasure hunters who had picked over most Maya sites like vultures at a carcass. This chamber had been waiting, perfectly preserved, for over 300 years. When they finally broke through and lowered themselves into that chamber, they found themselves in a time capsule. The air was thick with centuries of silence. The kind of silence that makes you whisper even when there's no one around to disturb. And there, in the center of this ancient room, sat a stone sarcophagus that had been waiting longer than most civilizations have existed. As they opened the lid, and imagine the tension here, because you never know what you're going to find in a Maya tomb. Red dust rose like smoke. Brilliant, shocking red dust that painted the air like some kind of supernatural special effect. The interior of the sarcophagus was covered in powdered cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide that the Maya used for their most sacred ceremonies. And lying within that crimson cloud was the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with the kind of care and reverence that screams this person was incredibly important. Her bones were fragile but intact, her skull still wearing a jade mask that had been assembled from dozens of tiny tiles. Around her were funerary offerings that would make modern jewelry collectors weep with envy. Necklaces, diadems, ear spools, all crafted from jade and shell with the kind of skill that takes generations to develop. Everything about this burial was royal. The location, the offerings, the elaborate preparation, the sacred red dust. It all pointed to someone who had wielded serious power during their lifetime. But here's where the mystery gets really interesting. There were no inscriptions, no glyphs identifying her, no carved texts explaining who she was or why she deserved such an elaborate send-off. It was one of the richest female burials ever found in Mesoamerica, and it was a complete enigma. The archaeologists had discovered someone incredibly important whose name had been lost to history. They started calling her the Red Queen, and the name stuck because really, what else do you call a mystery wrapped in jade and preserved in crimson? This discovery was like finding a missing chapter from a book you thought you'd already finished reading. The Maya civilization suddenly had a new character, someone who had clearly played a major role in the power structure of one of their greatest cities, but whose story had been hidden for over a millennium. The Red Queen had been waiting in her crimson cocoon, patient as only the dead can be patient, for someone to find her and wonder who she was. And now that she'd been found, she was about to become one of archaeology's most compelling mysteries. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that refuse to be told directly. Sometimes power leaves its mark, not in words carved in stone, but in the careful arrangement of jade and the sacred use of colors that speak louder than any inscription ever could. Now let's talk about that red dust, because it's not just pretty decoration. It's a message written in one of the most dangerous substances the ancient world knew how to create. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury sulfide, was essentially the Maya equivalent of handling radioactive material for religious purposes. It was beautiful, it was sacred, and it could absolutely kill you if you weren't careful. To understand what we're dealing with here, imagine if someone today decided to bury their most revered leader in powdered uranium because they thought it would help with spiritual transformation. That's basically what the Maya were doing with cinnabar, except they didn't know about mercury poisoning. They just knew this red powder was incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous. In Maya cosmology, red wasn't just a color, it was life force made visible, the color of blood, of sunrise, of the heart pumping life through the body. Red was the color of sacrifice, of transformation, of the moment when life crosses over into death and hopefully emerges into something greater. When the Maya covered someone in cinnabar, they weren't just preserving the body, they were preparing the soul for rebirth. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. Cinnabar is genuinely toxic. Prolonged exposure to mercury can cause tremors, hallucinations, neurological damage, and death. The Maya probably didn't understand the chemistry, but they definitely understood that this substance was powerful, volatile, and dangerous. It was like handling liquid lightning, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Very few people at Palenque were given the cinnabar treatment. We're talking about maybe 2 or 3 burials in the entire history of the site. Pakal the Great got it. His body was also saturated in red powder when they found him. That detail alone tells us something crucial about the Red Queen. She was being honored at the same level as Palenque's greatest king. The Maya didn't waste cinnabar on just anyone. This stuff was more valuable than gold, more sacred than jade, and more restricted than nuclear material in a modern democracy. Using it meant you were dealing with someone whose spiritual power was considered so significant that they needed the most potent transformation ritual available. Think about the logistics here. Someone had to mine the mercury ore, probably from dangerous deposits that required specialized knowledge to access safely. Then they had to process it into powder, probably losing a few workers to mercury poisoning along the way. Then they had to transport it to Palenque, store it carefully, and finally use it to cover every inch of the Red Queen's body and burial chamber. This was a massive investment of resources, time, and human life, all dedicated to ensuring that this one woman received the most powerful send-off possible. It's like building a rocket ship to launch someone's soul into the afterlife, except the rocket ship is made of toxic red powder in ancient prayers. The Red Queen's jade mask had been placed carefully over her skull, which was itself resting on jaguar skin, another sacred element that cost a fortune and required serious hunting skills to obtain. Jaguars were associated with rulership, with the underworld, with the kind of spiritual power that could cross between worlds. You didn't just throw jaguar skin into a burial unless you were dealing with someone who had jaguar-level spiritual authority. Around her were bone needles, obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines that suggested either rituals performed during her life or ceremonies conducted at her death. Every single item in that tomb had been chosen with spiritual significance. This wasn't random treasure. This was a carefully curated collection of power objects designed to help the Red Queen navigate whatever came after death. The cinnabar wasn't just covering her bones, it was throughout the entire burial chamber, coating the walls, the offerings, everything. It was like someone had detonated a red powder bomb in there, except it was done with religious precision and sacred intent. What we're looking at is one of the most elaborate spiritual transformation rituals ever discovered in Mesoamerica. The Red Queen wasn't just being buried, she was being prepared for deification. Someone believed that this woman was so important, so spiritually powerful, that she needed to be launched into the afterlife with the full force of Maya religious technology. And yet, despite all this obvious importance, despite the clear evidence that she was one of the most significant people in Palenque's history, her name was never written down. Or if it was, it's been lost to time, erosion, and the general unfairness of historical preservation. The red dust preserved her bones, but it couldn't preserve her story. Which means we're left with one of archaeology's most beautiful mysteries. A woman who was clearly powerful enough to deserve a burial fit for gods, but whose identity remains hidden in sacred silence. From the moment that tomb was opened, scholars started playing one of archaeology's favorite games. Who the hell was this person? And why were they so important? It's like historical detective work, except your clues are 300 years old. Your witnesses are all dead, and your primary evidence is a collection of jade jewelry and some very fancy red dust. The most compelling theory, and the one that gets archaeologists really excited, is that the Red Queen was Sakbu Ajah, the wife of Pakal the Great. Now, if this is true, it would mean we're looking at one of the most powerful royal couples in Maya history, buried side by side like some kind of ancient power duo. Zagbu Ajay wasn't just some decorative royal wife who spent her time embroidering and looking pretty at court ceremonies. She was born into nobility in her own right, married into Palenque's royal dynasty when she was young, and played a crucial role in legitimizing Pakal's rule. She bore at least 3 sons who went on to hold important positions, and she appears in Maya inscriptions as someone who participated in major religious ceremonies. In Maya politics, women weren't just baby-making machines. They were political players whose bloodlines and alliances could make or break dynasties. Sakbu Ajah brought her own noble heritage to the marriage, which strengthened Pakal's claim to the throne and created connections with other Maya cities. She was essentially a human treaty with fancy clothes and serious political influence. The evidence supporting this identification is compelling, but not definitive, which is basically the story of Maya archaeology in general. The tomb's location is crucial. It's literally just a few feet away from Pakal's own burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions. In ancient architecture, proximity equals significance. You don't build elaborate tombs next to each other unless you're making a statement about the relationship between the people buried there. Then there's the cinnabar connection. Only 2 burials at Palenque showed this intense red powder coverage: Pakal and the Red Queen. It's unlikely this was coincidence. The Maya were precise about their burial rituals, and using cinnabar was like deploying their most powerful spiritual weapon. If both Pakal and the Red Queen got the full cinnabar treatment, it suggests they were considered equals in terms of spiritual power and political importance. But here's where the mystery gets frustrating. DNA tests conducted on both sets of remains were inconclusive. The scientists hoped to find a definitive family connection that would settle the question once and for all. But ancient DNA is tricky, and the results didn't give them the clear answer they wanted. The lack of genetic connection doesn't rule out a spousal relationship. After all, husbands and wives aren't genetically related unless you're dealing with some very unfortunate royal family traditions. But it also doesn't confirm it, which means we're still in the realm of educated guessing rather than scientific certainty. Some scholars have suggested alternative theories. Maybe the Red Queen was Sakuk, Pakal's mother-in-law, who ruled Palenque as queen regent before her son came of age. Sakuk was definitely powerful enough to deserve such an elaborate burial. She literally kept the dynasty alive during a difficult period and paved the way for Pakal's reign. Others think she might have been a high priestess or a sister or some other female relative whose political importance has been lost to history. The Maya had complex family structures where power could flow through various bloodlines. And it's entirely possible that the Red Queen held a position we don't have a modern equivalent for. But here's what's really intriguing about this mystery. The lack of inscriptions might not be an oversight. It could be intentional. In Maya cosmology, some forms of power were considered too sacred to be written down. The Red Queen might have held a spiritual authority that was meant to be remembered through ritual and symbol rather than through written records. Think about it. If someone's power was considered so profound that it transcended normal human categories, you might not want to limit it by defining it in words. The jade mask, the cinnabar, the location, the offerings. These might have been a more appropriate way to preserve her memory than any inscription could have been. What we're left with is a woman who was clearly one of the most important people in Palenque's history, but whose identity remains tantalizingly just out of reach. She's like a ghost made of jade and cinnabar, a presence so powerful that it echoes across centuries, but refuses to be pinned down by something as mundane as a name. And maybe that's exactly how she would have wanted it. To really understand who the Red Queen might have been, we need to talk about something that would blow the minds of anyone who thinks ancient civilizations were all about male domination. Maya women had serious political power. We're not talking about being decorative appendages to their husband's authority. We're talking about actual, legitimate, make or break kingdoms kind of power. In Maya civilization, politics wasn't a boys' club. It was a family business where women were often the ones running the show behind the scenes, and sometimes right out in the open. Royal women weren't just producers of heirs, they were diplomats, religious leaders, military strategists, and political power brokers whose decisions could reshape entire regions. Take Sakuk, Pakal's mother, who we mentioned earlier. When Palenque's throne was left vacant and the succession was uncertain, she didn't just stand aside and let the men figure it out. She took power herself and ruled as queen regent until her son was old enough and politically secure enough to take over. She wasn't keeping the throne warm. She was actively ruling, making decisions, issuing decrees, and basically proving that competent leadership doesn't require a Y chromosome. And she wasn't unique. Across the Maya world, inscriptions and artworks show women performing major religious ceremonies, conducting diplomatic negotiations, and sometimes ruling cities in their own right. Lady Six Sky ruled Wak Kabnal for over 60 years. Lady of Tikal led military campaigns. These weren't exceptions. They were part of a political system that recognized female authority as legitimate and necessary. Maya women appeared in royal portraits dressed in elaborate regalia, holding symbols of power, standing beside kings as equals, or sometimes above them in the hierarchical composition. They weren't background figures. They were central players whose presence validated royal authority and whose absence could delegitimize it. But here's what makes Maya female power particularly fascinating. It wasn't just about individual exceptional women breaking through barriers. It was systemic. Maya political theory included concepts of complementary male and female authority, where certain types of power were specifically associated with women and couldn't be effectively wielded by men. Women controlled important religious rituals, managed diplomatic marriages that created alliances between cities, and served as links between the human and divine realms. Their bloodlines were political capital that could be inherited, traded, and leveraged to create or destroy dynasties. In a world where legitimacy came from divine ancestry, controlling the female lineages that carried that ancestry was crucial. This context completely reframes how we should think about the Red Queen. She wasn't buried with such elaborate honors because she was someone's wife or mother. She was honored because she held genuine political and spiritual authority that made her indispensable to Palenque's power structure. Her jade mask wasn't just decoration, it was a symbol of identity and authority that marked her as someone whose spiritual power needed to be preserved and protected even in death. The cinnabar wasn't just preservation, it was recognition that her transition to the afterlife was a matter of cosmic significance that required the most powerful ritual technology available. The Red Queen's burial suggests she was what we might call a power woman in the most literal sense. Someone whose authority was so fundamental to Palenque's political and religious order that losing her required elaborate measures to ensure her continued influence from beyond the grave. Maya queens weren't just ceremonial figures. They were political operatives whose networks of relationships, religious authority, and strategic intelligence were often more valuable than armies. They negotiated treaties, managed trade relationships, oversaw construction projects, and generally kept the complex machinery of Maya civilization running smoothly. And here's the really remarkable part: much of this female authority has been overlooked by archaeologists and historians who assume that ancient power structures must have resembled modern patriarchal systems. It's only recently that scholars have started recognizing the full extent of Maya women's political roles, which means we're probably still underestimating how important figures like the Red Queen actually were. The woman lying in that jade mask and cinnabar shroud wasn't just someone's relative who happened to get a fancy burial. She was likely a political and spiritual powerhouse whose influence shaped one of the greatest Maya cities during its golden age. Her name might be lost, but her power echoes across centuries in the elaborate care taken to ensure her proper transition to whatever comes after life. In Maya terms, she wasn't just a queen, she was a force of nature who happened to wear jewelry. Let's talk about where the Red Queen was buried, because in Maya culture, location isn't just real estate, it's a statement about cosmic significance. Political power and spiritual authority, it all rolled into one massive architectural message that's been sitting in the jungle for over a millennium. Temple 13, where our mysterious queen was discovered, isn't just a building, it's a carefully constructed bridge between the human world and the realm of the gods. Maya temples weren't churches where people went to worship. They were cosmic machines designed to facilitate communication between different layers of reality. Being buried in one wasn't just an honor, it was a promotion to divine status. The temple itself rises modestly compared to its famous neighbor, the Temple of the Inscriptions where Pakal was buried. But modest in Maya architecture still means impressive enough to make modern engineers weep with envy. We're talking about a pyramid built without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or domestic animals, using mathematical and astronomical principles that we're still trying to fully understand. But here's what makes the location so significant: proximity to Pakal's tomb wasn't accidental. In Maya urban planning, every structure was positioned according to complex calculations involving astronomy, mythology, and political relationships. The fact that the Red Queen's temple sits just feet away from Pakal's Grand Pyramid is basically a permanent announcement that these two people were connected at the highest levels of power. Think of it as ancient political advertising. Every Maya who looked at these two temples, standing side by side, would understand immediately that whoever was buried in Temple 13 was Pakal's equal in terms of spiritual authority and political importance. It's like building the Washington Monument next to the Lincoln Memorial. You're making a statement about comparable significance. The burial chamber itself is a masterpiece of intentional design. It's small, intimate, carved from stone that was shaped with tools that would make modern stoneworkers quit their jobs and take up something easier, like rocket science. The chamber feels personal despite being monumentally significant. It's like a private conversation with eternity. Unlike Pakal's tomb, which is covered with elaborate inscriptions and cosmic imagery, the Red Queen's chamber is notably silent. No glyphs explain who she was or why she deserves such treatment. No carved scenes show her journey to the afterlife. The walls are basically blank, which in Maya terms is almost more powerful than elaborate decoration. That silence feels intentional. Maya artists and architects didn't leave things blank by accident. Every surface was an opportunity to communicate important information. The fact that they chose not to identify the Red Queen in writing suggests that her power was considered too sacred, too fundamental, to be limited by something as mundane as carved text. The chamber is aligned east to west, following the path of the sun from life to death to rebirth. This isn't coincidence, it's cosmic engineering. The Maya understood architecture as a way of plugging into universal forces, and they positioned the Red Queen's eternal resting place to take advantage of the sun's daily journey between worlds. Her sarcophagus sits in the center of this stone chamber like an altar in a temple, which is basically what it is. The lid is simpler than Pakal's famous carving, showing his rebirth as the maze god. But simplicity in Maya terms often indicates even greater power. The most profound truths didn't need elaborate explanation. They spoke for themselves. The entire temple complex functions as a kind of spiritual launching pad designed to boost the Red Queen's soul into whatever comes after death with maximum divine assistance. Every stone was placed with purpose. Every angle calculated to align with cosmic forces that the Maya tracked with astronomical precision that rivals modern calculations. But here's what's truly remarkable: this architectural monument to the Red Queen's power has been sitting in the jungle for over 300 years, quietly insisting on her importance, even when her name was forgotten. The temple itself became her voice, speaking in stone and shadow about authority that transcended normal human categories. Maya architecture was designed to last basically forever, and Temple 13 has been making the same statement about the Red Queen's significance for longer than most civilizations have existed. It's been telling anyone who would listen that the woman buried in its heart was powerful enough to deserve a cosmic launching pad, important enough to merit eternal architectural advertisement of her status. The Red Queen might not have left written records, but she left something more permanent, a stone monument that refuses to let her be forgotten, even when everything else about her identity has been lost to time. Her temple stands as proof that some forms of power are too fundamental to be diminished by something as temporary as historical amnesia. In the end, the architecture tells us everything we need to know whoever the Red Queen was. She mattered enough to be given a permanent place in the cosmic order, and her importance was considered so fundamental that it needed to be announced in stone for as long as stone endures. We've journeyed from medieval misery to Catherine's cunning, and stood beside a Maya queen whose power spoke in red dust and sacred silence. But now let's leap forward to 20th century Mexico, where another extraordinary woman was about to transform pain into art that would outlast empires. If the Red Queen's story was written in jade and mystery, Frida Kahlo's would be painted in blood and defiance. Sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that refuse to stay quiet. Our final story brings us to the vibrant, chaotic, beautiful mess that was early 20th century Mexico, where a girl named Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo y Calderon was about to become one of the most iconic artists in human history. But before she was Frida the legend, she was just Frida the kid, a smart, stubborn, passionate girl growing up in a blue house that would eventually become a shrine to creativity and pain. Frida was born on July 6, 1907 in Coyoacan, which was then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Today it's a trendy neighborhood where people pay ridiculous amounts of money to live near where Frida used to exist. But back then it was just a place where a photographer and his wife were raising 4 daughters and trying to make sense of a world that was changing faster than anyone could keep up with. Her father, Guillermo Kahlo, was this fascinating contradiction, a German-Hungarian immigrant who had become more Mexican than most Mexicans, working as a photographer during a time when photography was still basically magic to most people. He was quiet, intellectual, and prone to epileptic seizures that would drop him to the ground without warning. Not exactly the stereotypical strong father figure, but perfect for raising a daughter who would grow up to see strength in vulnerability. Her mother, Matilde Calderon, was the opposite, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent who ran the household with the kind of iron discipline that makes military boot camps look like summer vacation. Matilde was emotionally distant in that particularly Mexican way, where love is expressed through criticism and affection, comes disguised as concern about your eternal soul. From these two people, the sensitive artist father and the tough, pragmatic mother, Frida inherited a combination of traits that would define her entire approach to life: an artist's eye for beauty, a philosopher's appetite for big questions, and a survivor's refusal to give up no matter how bad things got. As a child, Frida was what we would today call a handful. She was curious about everything, opinionated about most things, and completely uninterested in behaving the way little girls were supposed to behave in early 1900s Mexico. While other girls were learning to be quiet and obedient, Frida was asking uncomfortable questions and refusing to accept answers that didn't make sense to her. When she was 6, polio hit her like a freight train, leaving her right leg thinner and weaker than the other. In a time when physical disability was often seen as divine punishment or family shame, this could have destroyed a child's spirit. Instead, it seemed to concentrate Frida's defiance. If the world wanted to see her as damaged, she would prove that damage could be transformed into something magnificent. Her father encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and stay mentally sharp during the long months of recovery. Unlike most parents of his era, Guillermo didn't treat his daughter like a fragile flower who needed protection from the world. He treated her like a person who needed tools to engage with the world on her own terms. This early experience with physical limitation would prove to be crucial training for what was coming later. Frida learned, at age 6, that the human body could betray you without warning, but that the human spirit could fight back in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. By the time she was a teenager, Frida had developed into someone who was impossible to ignore. She was brilliant, accepted into the prestigious National Preparatory School as one of only 35 girls among 2,000 students. She was politically engaged, joining a group of student intellectuals who called themselves Los Cachuchas and spent their time debating philosophy, literature, and revolution. But most importantly, she had developed what we might call today an absolutely uncompromising sense of self. Frida knew who she was, what she believed, and what she wanted from life. And she wasn't particularly interested in anyone else's opinion about any of it. Her goal was to become a doctor, which in 1920s Mexico was about as likely for a young woman as becoming an astronaut would be today. But Frida had already proven that unlikely didn't mean impossible, and she approached her studies with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She was 18 years old, smart as hell, politically passionate, and absolutely convinced that the future was going to be whatever she decided to make it. She had survived polio, excelled in school, and developed into someone who could hold her own in any intellectual conversation, while also being the kind of person who made rooms more interesting just by walking into them. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo was riding a bus with her boyfriend, probably arguing about something because she argued about everything, when two vehicles collided and split her life into before and after. The girl who wanted to heal others was about to discover that sometimes the most important healing you can do is your own, and sometimes the most powerful art comes from the deepest pain. But none of that had happened yet. For now, she was just a brilliant, difficult, passionate young woman riding a bus through Mexico City, completely unaware that she was about to become one of history's most important artists in the most terrible way possible. September 17, 1925. Frida Kahlo gets on a bus after school with her boyfriend, Alejandro, probably still buzzing with whatever intellectual argument they'd been having. Because if you knew Frida, you knew she was always in the middle of some passionate debate about art, politics, or why everyone else was wrong about basically everything. They're riding this wooden bus through Mexico City, and Frida is being her usual self, animated, opinionated, probably gesturing wildly while making some point about Mexican politics or the future of education. She's 18 years old, brilliant, and absolutely convinced that the world is going to bend to her will through sheer force of personality and intelligence. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything changes forever. The bus collides with a streetcar. Not a gentle fender bender or a minor traffic incident. We're talking about a catastrophic crash where a streetcar basically crumples a wooden bus like it's made of paper. The impact is so violent that passengers are thrown around like dolls. Wood splinters fill the air like deadly confetti, and the sound of metal hitting metal creates the kind of noise that people remember for the rest of their lives. Frida gets impaled by an iron handrail that enters through her pelvis and exits through her vagina. Her spinal column fractures in 3 places. Her right leg shatters. Her foot gets dislocated so severely it's basically hanging by tendons. Her collarbone breaks, her ribs crack, her shoulder dislocates, and her abdomen gets pierced by the same metal rod that's holding her to the wreckage like some kind of horrific sculpture. But here's the detail that somehow makes the whole thing even more surreal. Frida had been carrying a small bag of gold powder, the kind art students use for illuminated artwork. When the crash happened, the bag exploded, covering her broken body in what looked like glittering dust. Witnesses said she looked like a strange, broken angel lying in the wreckage, sparkling with gold while her life leaked out onto the street. Someone covers her with a coat. Someone else notices that this girl who looks like she should be dead is still breathing, still conscious, still somehow present in her own disaster. They get her to the Red Cross hospital, where doctors take one look at her and probably wonder if they should even bother trying. The medical assessment is basically a catalog of everything that can go wrong with a human body: massive internal bleeding, multiple fractures, potential paralysis, and injuries that in 1925, Mexico would probably be considered incompatible with survival. The doctors perform emergency surgery, then more surgery, then more surgery. Each one trying to put back together a person who has been fundamentally disassembled by physics and bad luck. Frida spends the next several months flat on her back, encased in plaster casts and metal braces, basically immobilized while her body tries to remember how to be a body. The future she had planned, medical school, healing others, changing the world through science, disappears into a fog of pain and uncertainty. But here's where Frida's story becomes something extraordinary instead of just tragic. Her father brings her painting supplies. Her mother rigs up a special easel that hangs above her bed so she can paint while lying down. They install a mirror on the ceiling so she can see herself. Because when you're immobilized and facing an uncertain future, sometimes the only subject available is your own reflection. And lying there in that hospital bed, wrapped in plaster and metal, unable to move anything except her hands and her mind, Frida Kahlo begins to paint. Not because she always wanted to be an artist, but because painting becomes the only way she can process what has happened to her. The only way she can maintain some sense of agency in a situation where everything else has been taken away. Her first paintings are small, intimate, painted on whatever surfaces are available. She paints herself because, as she later said, "I paint myself because I am so often alone and because I am the subject I know best." But these aren't vanity projects. They're psychological autopsies, emotional x-rays of someone trying to understand how to exist in a body that has been fundamentally altered. The accident didn't just break Frida's body, it shattered her entire conception of what her life was going to be. The girl who wanted to heal others now had to learn how to heal herself. And she discovered that sometimes healing doesn't mean going back to what you were before. Sometimes healing means becoming something completely new. In that hospital bed, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the sound of her own labored breathing, Frida Kahlo stopped being a pre-med student and started becoming one of the most important artists of the 20th century. She didn't choose this transformation. It was forced on her by metal and gravity and the random cruelty of traffic accidents. But she chose what to do with it. And what she chose was to pick up a paintbrush and start documenting what it means to be human in a body that refuses to cooperate, in a world that doesn't always make sense, and in a life that had just been rewritten without her permission. The bus crash took away the life Frida had planned. But it gave her something else, a subject matter, so profound and personal that it would fuel decades of art that still makes people stop breathing when they see it for the first time. So there's Frida, flat on her back in a body that feels like it belongs to someone else, staring at her reflection in a mirror rigged above her hospital bed. Most people in her situation might have given up, fallen into depression, or spent their time feeling sorry for themselves. Instead, Frida picked up a paintbrush and basically said, "If this is my reality now, I'm going to document every brutal, beautiful detail of it." What emerged from that hospital bed was unlike anything anyone had seen before, so Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or peaceful landscapes. She painted pain, but she painted it with such honesty and skill that it transformed suffering into something that was somehow also beautiful. It's like she took the worst thing that had ever happened to her and alchemized it into gold. Her early paintings were small, intimate works done on tin or wood panels because canvas was expensive, and she didn't know if this art thing was going to last. But these weren't amateur attempts at distraction. They were sophisticated psychological documents that showed an artist's eye developing in real time. Frida painted herself as split open, as pierced by nails, as bleeding, as broken. In one painting, she shows herself floating in a hospital bed with symbols of loss and trauma connected to her by red ribbons, a fetus representing her inability to have children, medical instruments representing her ongoing relationship with surgery, a snail representing the slowness of healing. It was raw, graphic, and emotionally devastating. But here's what made Frida's approach to pain revolutionary. She never painted herself as a victim. Even when she was documenting the most horrific aspects of her experience, her painted self looked directly at the viewer with eyes that seemed to say, "This is what happened to me, and I survived it, and now I'm showing it to you because truth matters more than comfort." She developed a visual language that blended Mexican folk art, surrealist techniques, and medical illustration into something entirely new. Her paintings looked like dreams, but they were actually more like scientific studies of emotional and physical trauma. She was basically inventing a new form of portraiture where the subject's inner life was as visible as their outer appearance. Traditional Mexican retablos, devotional paintings that told stories of suffering and miraculous survival, became one of her major influences. But where retablos usually showed saints or divine intervention, Frida showed herself as both the sufferer and the saint, the patient and the miracle. She was documenting her own martyrdom and resurrection, painting by painting. What's remarkable is how quickly her technical skills developed. This wasn't someone who had been training to be an artist since childhood. This was someone who picked up painting as a form of physical therapy and discovered she had an almost supernatural ability to translate internal experience into visual form. It's like discovering you're a natural athlete while learning to walk again after an accident. Frida's paintings became a kind of ongoing autobiography written in oil paint and symbolism. Each canvas was a chapter in the story of how to remain human when your body is actively working against you, how to find beauty in circumstances that seem designed to destroy beauty, and how to maintain agency when almost everything else has been taken away. By the time she was well enough to move around again, walking with a cane, still in pain, still requiring ongoing medical treatment, Frida had discovered that art wasn't just something she could do. It was something she had to do. Painting had become as necessary as breathing, as fundamental as eating. She had found her voice, and that voice was unlike anyone else's. While other artists painted what they imagined or what they thought people wanted to see, Frida painted what she knew with absolute certainty, the interior landscape of a person who had been broken apart and was rebuilding herself piece by piece. Her art became a form of survival, but also a form of rebellion. In a world that preferred to look away from pain, disability, and the messier aspects of human existence, Frida was saying, look at this. Really look at it. This is also part of life, and it deserves to be seen and understood and even celebrated. She wasn't painting pretty pictures to make people feel good. She was painting true pictures to make people feel something real. And in doing so, she was pioneering a form of art that would influence generations of artists who understood that the most powerful creativity often comes from the deepest wounds. The girl who had wanted to heal bodies through medicine discovered that she could heal souls through art. And sometimes that's an even more profound form of healing. In 1928, Frida Kahlo, now walking again but still carrying a cane and a complicated relationship with her own body, decided she needed professional validation for this art thing she'd been doing. So she did what any confident young artist would do. She tracked down Mexico's most famous painter and basically demanded his opinion. That painter was Diego Rivera, and meeting him was like stepping into the path of a cultural hurricane. Diego was 20 years older than Frida, absolutely massive in both physical size and artistic reputation, and already established as Mexico's premier muralist. He painted enormous public artworks that told the story of Mexican history, politics, and social revolution on the walls of buildings where everyone could see them. Frida found him working on a mural at the Ministry of Education, standing on scaffolding with paint-covered clothes in the kind of focused intensity that comes from creating something monumental. She interrupted his work because Frida was never one to wait for a convenient moment, and basically said, "Hey, look at my paintings and tell me if I have any talent. But don't lie to me because I can handle the truth." Diego climbed down from the scaffolding, looked at her work, and recognized something extraordinary. This wasn't the polite, decorative art that women were usually encouraged to create. This was raw, honest, technically skilled, and unlike anything he'd seen before. He told her she had genuine talent, and not just to be kind. What happened next was one of art history's most famous and complicated love stories. Diego was a notorious womanizer who collected beautiful women the way other people collect stamps. He was larger than life, politically radical, internationally famous, and absolutely magnetic in the way that brilliant, terrible men often are. Frida was young, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, and walking with a cane. She was also drop-dead gorgeous, intellectually formidable, and completely unimpressed by Diego's reputation. When her parents met Diego, they called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove, which tells you everything you need to know about how mismatched this relationship looked from the outside. They married in 1929, and it was immediately clear that this wasn't going to be a traditional marriage. Diego was constitutionally incapable of fidelity. He had affairs constantly, openly, and with anyone who caught his interest, including Frida's own sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated by his betrayals, but also determined not to be destroyed by them. Her solution was characteristically Frida if Diego was going to have affairs. So was she. She took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored relationships with Leon Trotsky and possibly Georgia O'Keeffe. If Diego thought he could play by different rules because he was a famous man, Frida was going to show him that two could play that game. But their relationship was more than just mutual infidelity and artistic collaboration. They were both passionate about communist politics, both committed to creating art that served the Mexican people, and both convinced that personal relationships should be revolutionary acts that challenged bourgeois conventions. Diego supported Frida's art in ways that were crucial to her development. He encouraged her to paint larger canvases, helped her get exhibitions, and used his influence to introduce her work to collectors and critics. He understood that Frida's intimate, personal style was just as politically powerful as his massive public murals. They divorced in 1939 after Diego's affair with Cristina finally pushed Frida past her breaking point. But they remarried a year later, this time with different terms. Frida would maintain her own house, her own finances, and her own independence. She would be Diego's wife when she chose to be, not because legal documents said she had to be. Their second marriage was less about romantic love and more about creative partnership and mutual recognition. They were both too stubborn, too passionate, and too committed to their art to make conventional marriage work. But they were also too connected, intellectually and artistically, to stay apart. Diego remained a constant presence in Frida's life and work. He challenged her, wounded her, supported her, and frustrated her in equal measure. He was simultaneously her greatest champion and her biggest disappointment, the person who understood her art best and the person who hurt her most consistently. But here's what's remarkable about their relationship despite all the drama, betrayal, and emotional chaos. It produced some of the most important art of the 20th century. They pushed each other to be more politically engaged, more artistically ambitious, and more willing to use their creativity as a form of social action. Frida's paintings from this period show her processing not just physical pain, but emotional complexity. She painted herself as split between different identities, as bleeding from emotional wounds, as strong enough to survive betrayal and loss. Her art became a way of working through what it meant to love someone who was incapable of loving anyone completely. Together, Frida and Diego were not peaceful, but they were legendary. They created a partnership that was equal parts inspiration and destruction, a relationship that proved that love doesn't have to be comfortable to be transformative. By the 1930s, Frida wasn't just an artist, she was becoming a symbol. But symbols are complicated things, especially when you are still a living, breathing, painting person who has to wake up every morning in a body that refuses to cooperate, and a world that's constantly trying to define you according to other people's needs. Frida's politics were as personal as her art and as complicated as her relationship with Diego. She joined the Mexican Communist Party not because it was fashionable, but because she genuinely believed that art should serve the people and that personal liberation was impossible without social revolution. She saw her own struggle with disability and pain as connected to larger struggles against oppression and injustice. When Leon Trotsky arrived in Mexico in 1937, fleeing Stalin's persecution, Frida and Diego welcomed him into their home. Frida reportedly had an affair with Trotsky, which was either a romantic relationship or a political statement or both. With Frida, the personal and political were always intertwined in ways that made people uncomfortable. But politics for Frida wasn't just about ideology, it was about identity. She wore traditional Tehuana dresses not just because they were beautiful, but because they were a statement about Mexican indigenous culture and resistance to European colonial influence. Every morning, Frida got dressed like she was putting on armor for a cultural war. Her paintings during this period became increasingly political. But in Frida's uniquely personal way, instead of painting obvious propaganda, she painted herself as Mexico, wounded, colonized, bleeding, but also strong, defiant, and ultimately unconquerable. She made her own body into a map of Mexican history and identity. Meanwhile, her physical condition was deteriorating. The spinal injuries from the bus accident required multiple surgeries, each one offering the promise of relief and the reality of more complications. Frida spent months at a time in bed, immobilized by body casts and metal braces that were supposed to support her spine, but felt more like medieval torture devices. She painted through it all, propped up in bed, easel positioned over her body, mirror reflecting her face so she could continue her lifelong conversation with her own image. Pain became her most reliable companion and her most consistent artistic subject. She painted herself crying, bleeding, split open, held together by metal corsets and sheer willpower. But Frida's approach to pain was never self-pitying. She painted suffering with the same unflinching honesty she brought to everything else, refusing to sanitize or romanticize her experience. If this was her reality, she was going to document it with scientific precision and artistic genius. Her painting, The Broken Column from 1944, shows her split down the middle, her spine replaced by a crumbling ionic column, her body pierced with nails like a secular martyrdom. Her face is stoic, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her gaze direct and unapologetic. It's a portrait of someone who has been broken apart but refuses to be defeated. In 1953, Frida was finally given her first solo exhibition in Mexico, recognition that was long overdue but deeply meaningful. By this time, her health was so fragile that doctors told her she couldn't attend the opening. So Frida did what Frida always did. She ignored the doctors and created her own solution. She arrived at the gallery by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the exhibition space on her hospital bed. Dressed in traditional Mexican clothing, surrounded by her own artwork, she greeted guests while lying flat on her back. It was classic Frida, turning limitation into spectacle, making her own terms even when her body was failing. Her final paintings were both childlike and devastating. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she painted herself supported by the hands of Marx, while casting away symbols of capitalism and imperialism. Her last known work was a still life of watermelons, one slice bearing the words, "Viva la vida," long live life, even facing death. Frida remained defiant, political, and absolutely committed to squeezing every drop of meaning from whatever time she had left. She understood that her life had become larger than her individual experience. She had become a symbol of resistance, creativity, and the refusal to be diminished by circumstances beyond your control. When Frida died on July 13, 1954, at age 47, she left behind more than paintings. She left behind a new way of thinking about art, disability, identity, and the relationship between personal and political liberation. She had proven that the most profound creativity often emerges from the deepest struggle, and that true power comes not from avoiding pain, but from transforming it into something that serves a larger purpose. Her last diary entry was brief but perfect. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." Even in death, Frida was making her own terms, refusing to accept other people's expectations about how she should feel or what she should want. She had turned a life that could have been defined by limitation into a celebration of possibility. And in doing so, she created art that still stops people in their tracks, still makes them reconsider what they think they know about strength, beauty, and what it means to be fully human.